I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
Today, we are going to be getting into our first rendition of our 2023 season in review player profiles for the Dallas Mavericks. Starting off with a bang with rookie Jaden Hardy. We are going to be getting into a variety of different things with him, talking about his strengths, his weaknesses, what things that we would like to see him improve upon going forward. The sustainability, in terms of like his future with the Mavericks and a few other cool digs. But before we do that, here is an ad from our sponsor, Spotify for Podcasters. All right, Jaren, so getting into it, Jaden Hardy's game this year was filled with a lot of ups and downs, definitely a lot of growing pains, but he really came into his own towards the end of the season and served as one of the biggest contributing role players on the Mavericks team. And some would argue that that role should have been optimized and harnessed earlier in the season by Jason Kidd. But there were some noticeable flaws throughout certain stretches of the season for him. Starting out with his biggest weaknesses, what do you think some of his more glaring weaknesses were throughout the season, and some things that made you kind of just shake your head and possibly can, kind of want to yank him out the game just because he simply, was making such bad mistakes, essentially. I was going to say non-contributor, but there's a lot of other Mavericks guys on this roster that we can label as non-contributors. I don't think that we could ever put Hardy necessarily in that boat, but he's definitely a guy that, had some of the more lackadaisical mistakes on this roster throughout the season. So what were some of those mistakes, and what were some of his more glaring weaknesses this season?
Yeah, I think as a 19-year-old rookie coming into this league, like you're going to expect growing pains. You're going to expect some mistakes to be happening, and that's exactly what happened. Definitely early on in that season, you could definitely tell more growing pains more than anything. Decision making, when to and when not to drive, or when to pass, maybe when to kick the ball out for an open shooter. It was just things along that line. I think pushing the ball in transition, he had some trouble with, especially early on. Making some deciding factors, who to go up on, whether or not to dribble out, and waste some shot clock, or even just go up. And oftentimes he would go up on a scenario where it's an easy kick out to an open shooter, and we would see him either get swatted or just put up an air ball down low. And like I said, just moments like that were honestly really cringy to see, but that you can't really expect anything else from a 19-year-old second round rookie. We knew coming into the season that decision making would be a problem, and that's we didn't see anything other than that. I would say, I know we're going to get into this a little later, but I would say that he definitely, and especially post Kyrie trade, learned from his mistakes and really figured it out. I would say more so than didn't, but especially early on in that season was where we saw the sort of black hole effect that he could bring at times. As I mentioned, just bad decision making. On the defensive side of things, I think he surprised a lot of people with his defensive capabilities, but even still, as a team defender, I felt like he was kind of lackadaisical, kind of lost in a swirl for a little bit. There was some moments there around really the middle, beginning of the season where, either as a one-on-one defender or just a rotational defender, it was kind of hard to watch him sort of work within the system. Whether just getting lost on an island or, forgetting where his defender is, he'd get caught in like sort of back cut scenarios or even 45 cut scenarios. But I think those problems really honestly figured themselves out. I think, as I mentioned, that post Kyrie trade, he really figured some things out, started to work on some things. And in fact, in the month of March was his best month as a rookie. But even still, you saw those growing pains, you saw those rookie mistakes, if you will. And I mean, to me, I think the decision making was probably the biggest sort of growing pain, or at least like rookie wall, if you will, that he was hitting. I don't know how you feel about that, but I think to me that was probably the most noticeable thing that you can watch night in and night out.
Yeah, I would definitely tend to agree with you from that standpoint because we saw in some of those games earlier in the season, especially some of those ones in which Luca missed, because a lot of the times Jaden Hardy earlier in the season was relegated to playing with the Texas Legends. He didn't really get a sustainable role with the Mavericks till maybe late February, early March. Really after the Kyrie trade, and even still, it was more along the lines of 10 to 20 minutes per game. He was never, he never had such an influx of minutes come his way consistently to where he was an integral part of the rotation. But he was definitely an integral part of the rotation throughout certain stretches of this season. And early on, in some of the games before Kyrie and everything that Luca had missed, we often, saw times that he had to spearhead the offense and he was thrust into position, albeit maybe a little bit unfairly, if you will, because of just the lack of consistent NBA minutes he was getting. It was a position that the team needed a ball handler, and there was that weird sort of gray area where the Mavericks were just rotating, basically, like one of those office building doors that go around in circles. I don't know the exact name
I
for
don't
that.
know the exact name.
Yeah, but there was a time there where the Mavericks were rotating through ball handlers like that. We saw the tertiary ball handler of the offense be Facu Campazzo. Then it was Kemba Walker. And, once they realized that both of those guys weren't going to contribute in any sort of role that was going to be meaningful, then, that's when Hardy's name was kind of thrusted into the equation. And, he never, I don't think earlier in the season got to a point where he was able to get consistent minutes, but we did see some big games against some of these teams. I look back to one of those early season matchups against Chicago where he had a really good game. But even in some of those bigger games, we did see how, despite the flashes, the dribble drive attack that he was able to really impose, his ability to get out in transition, his ability to size up mismatches and diagnose them correctly, and even towards the end of the season, we saw him be able to operate in the pick and roll a little bit better. Despite all that, he still did, have some ineffectiveness in terms of the decisions that he made. And, he'd have some of these, at face value, sort of gaudy stat lines, right? Where we'd see him put up like 25, 30 points, but oftentimes it would be, I wouldn't say abysmal field goal shooting, but it was definitely like, very high volume and, comparable to the amount of makes that he had. It wasn't, what you would maybe idealistically hope for as a guy who has to spearhead an offense. And I think that there was maybe some false promise with some Mavs fans when they saw just the counting stats of Jaden Hardy. You see a guy put up 30 points when Luka's out. That definitely, it gets your brain sort of wired, and you're like, oh, geez, this guy definitely needs to play more. And I think that towards the end of the season, he definitely earned a role, and probably even a bigger role than Jason Kidd really actually gave to him. But really towards the beginning of the season, I don't know if I can necessarily say that that was the case. I think that oftentimes he was just kind of a benefactor of, being the only ball handler out there at times. But even still, for him to sift through those moments and really, build the trust of his teammates and what have you, was really, vital for his development to be able to, go out and play, the full starters, basically rotation as the main ball handler in some of those matchups where Luka was out earlier in the season, and have to stomach both the ups and downs of a full NBA game. I really do think it boded well for his development down the stretch. So, keeping that in mind, that I think that's a perfect segue to what some of his strengths were, Jaren. What do you think Jaden Hardy's strengths were this season with the Mavericks? At least the most like prominent strengths that we saw, aside from maybe some of the things that we kind of already knew going into the draft when the Mavericks selected him out of the G League Ignite.
Yeah, so I think honestly, my most surprising, idea, or at least, whenever I had an idea of what Jaden Hardy was going into the season, the thing that not surprised me the most, but I think definitely didn't realize how good and talented he was taking defenders one-on-one and getting to the hole as fast as he could. There was some decision-making parts that, of course we just mentioned where it was kind of, shouldn't have taken it there moments, but definitely whenever they did occur and whenever they did have their positive moments, it was honestly really intriguing to see because that's a young prospect able to make a move most of the time on one of the top defenders because I mean, just this Mavericks roster at the beginning of the season was so depleted of scores that, oftentimes Jaden Hardy is going to draw one of the best defenders on the other team. So oftentimes on those one-on-one drives, he was, picking up some of the better defenders on the other teams and being able to work off that, and especially his ability to not float in midair, but have like this sort of Kyrie-esque ability to just will his way to the basket and will his shot into the hoop. Because at times it did look like he was caught in midair, or caught like a fish out of water, where he shouldn't be in those sort of moments that he is, and he found a way to will his way and get the ball in the hoop. So I think that his finishing ability and just taking defenders one-on-one using his first natural step and even off the dribble was honestly really surprising to me and was a really positive benefactor. And definitely, throughout the season, he definitely worked on that. I think probably the best thing that we saw out of him this season was sort of his ability to work off the ball. Because oftentimes whenever he was in, and it wasn't just him in the lineup, he was in there with either Kyrie or Luka, or sometimes even, or like honestly, rarely both. But his ability to work off the ball, find himself in a catcher's ability to be either in the corner or rotate out to a wing, his ability to do that, find the open spot, and then nail down the jumper was honestly his biggest upgrade, I think, that this team really needed, especially down the stretch. Now, of course, there's other factors that, kind of filled out, but I think that was probably the biggest sort of positive that we got from him. And then I think that's something, we will see more of definitely next season. But definitely you could see the bright spot starting to fill out, was an off-ball screen. They started to run sets for him, whether it was a curl off or curl down, getting to the hoop, using his mid-range jumper. I think we saw a lot of that down the stretch. I can recall multiple times in that Chicago and Spurs game in the last two games of the season where he's able to use a curl off screen to get downhill and either work one-on-one with the defender or just use his ability to pull up in the mid-range. I think that's something that I would like to see worked on a lot more in the offseason. But definitely his most positive, I think, sort of light that we saw this season was for sure. And in fact, his shooting, because as you mentioned, a minute ago, that there was some stat lines there where, he was maybe shooting like 11 for 27 or something like that. Just some bad, field goal percentage. But we saw that sort of mend itself, especially in the month of March. So I think field goal efficiency, as the season progressed, definitely went up, and just sort of shot making and, his ability to find an open spot and become a good shooter, especially as the months sort of prevailed throughout the NBA season.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head with really all the positive points that I was going to go over with him. I don't have too much more to add, but, I really do also like the point that you added on about them using him in, those curl off actions really towards the end of the season to get him the ball at that nail area and let him get downhill. For a Mavericks team that, it's not sort of ludicrous to say this because Kyrie and Luka, are so egregiously good at basketball, but, to an extent, you have to have some sort of stopgap measures because teams will just really key in on those two guys. And, the Mavericks may have been able to do a better job at just having some more direct Kyrie Luka actions to where they could make teams pay a little bit more if they were to trap one of them. But, even so, when a team really is committed to trapping two guys at a time, they're going to be able to do so. And with how one-dimensional the Mavericks offense was, we really didn't see a whole lot of Kyrie, Luka, Hardy at the same time. Even down the stretch, we saw it a little bit, but there's just a sort of lack of defense, among other things, that makes that lineup sort of hard to play. But, as Jaden Hardy evolves on defense and, the Mavericks hopefully are able to mend some of their other defensive holes this offseason, if there needs to be an interjection of offense, and Hardy's role increases next year, I definitely think we could see those lineups a little bit more. And when you have all three of those guys, running those flare actions in between them, as we saw down the stretch, as poised as a catch and shoot shooter that Hardy is going to be really beneficial for the Mavericks as they continue next season. But yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest thing that probably shocked me was just his catch and shoot ability, because the whole cliche sort of just vibe around him when he was coming into the league was that this was a guy that, was a primary ball handler, but he sort of had these abysmal shooting numbers when he went to the G League Ignite right out of high school. And, it was, a lot of it was kind of attributed to shot selection. But a lot of it was also kind of just not shooting the best, but he was always a really good shooter in high school. And, we saw a little bit of shooting woes early on, but I mean, if he corrected one thing and really took a stride, far and ahead of all others in his game, it was definitely his shooting. We did see him improve his playmaking as well as his decision making down the stretch, and his ability to work off ball and come off staggers and curl offs. But his ability to just kind of probe around the wings and the corners, and just be savvy and ready and poised to make big time shots time in and time out was really impressive for a rookie. And there's a lot of good catch and shoot shooters that come into the league as rookies out of college, and even still there's usually like a 1 or 2 year carryover for them to really hit their stride, just due to the sheer amount of pressure that it takes to play in an NBA game. Like even guys like AJ Griffin for the Hawks is a guy that I think about, Andrew Nembhard. Like those are some really poised rookies in terms of their ability to shoot the ball coming in day one, being contributors and not really being fazed by the moment. I don't think throughout Jaden Hardy's rookie year, despite maybe some of the mistakes he made, that he is a guy that just kind of by de facto of the nature of him, he's just not a guy who really gets fazed. He's a guy who's gonna, if there's a big shot to be hit, I'll be damned if he's not going to at least take it. He's definitely not a guy that is fazed, and that was probably one of also just the more shocking things and overt positives, in my opinion, for him as a rookie. But other than that, Jaren, I think you touched up specifically really well on all of Jaden Hardy's sort of strengths and weaknesses that we diagnosed right there. What do you think he improved from his time in the G League Ignite to his time in Dallas the most? I guess I kind of alluded to it in that segment, but if you'd like to iterate, something or to the effect of what I said or something else, what do you think was his biggest improvement from, his time at the semi-professional level? Or I don't know what.
No, I understand what you're saying. I think probably the biggest improvement he made was not necessarily decision making, but shot making. I think I want to say he shot like 45% from the field or 40% from the field, and then like maybe in the mid 20s of 3-point percentage.
So I think high 20s or yeah,
it was somewhere around there. I think his like true shooting percentage was in the 40s. Just really abysmal shooting percentages.
Yeah, I mean, true shooting percentage is typically a statistic that, I mean, is routinely in the 50s for anybody that's exactly like a halfway competent shooter,
Yeah, so I think, and that's a big reason why his draft stock plummeted.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, coming into the league, I necessarily didn't think that was going to be a problem. I didn't really feel like it was a problem through at least large stints of the season, or at least large stints that we got to see him, in plays where, he was was able to produce and play. So I think his shooting percentage and his shooting efficiency was honestly something that probably improved the most. I think, everyone in the league, I think it was maybe a question mark, but I think everyone in the league kind of knew that, you're not going to get a 40% shooter with Jaden Hardy, or at least a 40% true shooter with Jaden Hardy. And he definitely showed around the league and, to himself, and I think a lot of his fans, that, that was just a fluke of a season, maybe a little, warm up going from high school level to the semi-pro level. I think it's probably a little bit of that, but definitely, as his time as a Dallas Maverick progressed, and he sort of found his role and found his rhythm, I would say his shooting was probably something that improved the most.
Yeah, I mean, that's just really a drastic jump to shooting in the high 20s at the G League level to, being able to hit 40% plus from three once he got to the NBA stage. I mean, yeah, that's kind of what I was alluding to, though, is his shooting was just very surprising to me how he was able to completely shift the narrative from that perspective. And it definitely changes his value as a player because this was a guy that was, seen as possibly a lottery talent. And, even despite the Mavericks having Luka and Kyrie and there being no sort of, way to kind of pencil in Hardy into the equation as far as like maybe the starting lineup goes next year. There was a lot of promise shown from that department, just his ability to play off ball. But also, you see the sort of grassroots coming into fruition with the playmaking and the decision making. And if he can really harness that, I mean, we're talking about a guy that has, that sort of Bradley Beal-esque potential. Me and Jaren denoted him as a pretty comparable guy to him before the season even started, even though, we preface that he may never ever actually get to that level. But I mean, Jaden Hardy's potential, I mean, I don't know where he ends up being, but I think needless to say that we can both agree after this season, just from seeing some of the sparks, as well as the consistency shooting and the strides that he's made in that department and just sort of his demeanor, that this is a guy that does have all-star potential. Now, whether he reaches that remains to be seen, but I think that, as far as his season goes for the Mavericks, I would definitely give it, an A because, I mean, we got much more than we could have expected from him, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with what you say. I guess I'm going to ask you a question now. What do you think Jaden Hardy's biggest improvements over the offseason that he needs to make to either find himself in a bigger role next year or just as a player, what kind of improvements does he need to make? And then what kind of role do you think he'll be conducted to come this time next, or not, maybe not this time next year, but come next season? What kind of role do you want to see him in?
I think the improvements and strides that he made towards the end of the season, if he's at least able to keep that as a baseline, I mean, you're already looking at a fairly integral, cog in the Mavericks rotation here, especially if he can really catch wind as a playmaker and as a ball handler. I think his role is definitely going to be conducive to who kind of comes and goes for the Mavericks over the offseason. If the Mavericks lose a guy like Tim Hardaway Jr., who kind of alleviates some of the just sort of ancillary things that Hardy does, such as, his shooting and his off-ball movement, things of that nature, just that sort of gravity that he's going to start accruing on offense as his career kind of goes forward. If he keeps shooting the ball like this, I think that, if Tim is a guy that leaves, which could definitely present itself as a likely scenario this offseason, Hardy could be looking at, almost maybe like a 6-man, 7th-man esque role for the Mavericks off the bench. I don't know in his current state and the Mavericks' current state with their roster, and this is not me saying they have a good roster, but just based on how they are structured and put together at the moment, just because of Tim, I think that unless Hardy improves his ball handling and his playmaking as well as his decision making and his ability to operate in pick and roll actions and just to be a secondary ball handler out there, giving one of the stars the rest if obviously Kyrie comes back, just the ability to give one of the stars the rest and have another playmaker out there. I don't know if we ever got to a point this season where we could call Hardy a playmaker, but if we do that next season, then we're definitely looking at a guy that is poised to become a 6-man of the year candidate like soon, because that's just really just the next step in his development is really being able to hone in on his attacks, being savvy in terms of, making the right decision in terms of going up at a guy or, maybe choosing not to split a double team sometimes and making the correct read. All those things are going to be integral in terms of his, place in the rotation going forward. So, I'm more on the more optimistic and opportunistic side with this guy because, despite whatever injury situations were going on with the Mavericks, time in and time again throughout the season, even if he had one or two rough stretches, he continually bounced back and showed improvement throughout all the season. And he's only 20 years old. I think from, both an offensive perspective, he seems like a guy who is, an extremely hard worker like we've seen all season. I'm sure he'll work with Sham God and the coaching staff to really hone in on the ball handling and the playmaking aspect of things. And then if he's going to be able to also be a little bit more savvy as a defender, because, we didn't really touch up on his defense too much in this podcast, but, you obviously alluded to how earlier in the season he had a tendency to get lost within the rotations and things of that nature. I think if he can really hone in on that, he's already a fairly decent individual defender just because of his length and his lateral quickness and his general speed. I think if he can, hone in on that side a little bit more and just become a little bit more of a splashy impact defender than he already is at face value, and in a little, less mistake prone, then, we're really talking about a sort of like DeAnthony Melton-esque, type of guy almost coming off your bench. But, maybe with a little more like offensive pop. That's like the extreme bright side. And then the extreme low side is, maybe he sort of walks into a sophomore slump, like we've seen a lot of rookies do, and he experiences some shooting woes, and maybe we got some sort of fool's gold. So we don't obviously exactly know what's going to happen. I mean, this is a second-year player. They're about as unpredictable as they come. But if I'm, making an estimation, Mavericks rotations aside, who is going to come back, who's not going to come back, I think he's at least going to be, if the Mavericks, because all NBA teams, I like to denote them, even the really good ones with deep rotations. I think you have, your prominent 8. And then, the guys after that, they could or, could not be played in the playoff series. I expect Jaden Hardy to be in the prominent 8 for the Mavericks next season, in worst or best case scenario. All right. So obviously, that kind of covers the whole basis in terms of what I really think Jaden Hardy can do to elevate, his standing in terms of the Mavericks rotation next year, but also in terms of just a sort of baseline that I see for him as well. What are you most looking forward to him next season, other than just, his continued development? Like, how excited are you for this guy to be in a Mavericks uniform next year?
Yeah, I think, of a season filled with despair and very little bright spots, for him to be one of the bright spots and honestly one of a huge plus to this roster, I'm really intrigued to see him next year. I think next year, we hope, we can only assume, is going to be a big year for the Mavericks. And I think that I think for both of us, we fully expect him to be a part of that, and to be fully a part of a bigger role in which he was given this year. So I think the biggest thing I'm really looking forward to is what sort of role he's given, because I would think, not saying he's like this player at all, but I think he'd be given more of a comparable role like Terrence Mann, maybe last year or 2 years ago, where, he's the guy you can sort of plug in as a 6-man, but also, you can bring him in off the bench as like the 8 or 9 spot, just kind of depending on who you're playing and what kind of matchups prevail. I think that that's sort of the player that I want to see most. Definitely, I mean, if he could pick up some defensive habits that are, of course, positive, I think that would be really intricate for this defense, especially off the bench. But yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing I'm looking forward to, is what sort of role he finds himself in and how much he can elevate his game. Because I mean, really, I think, at the end of the season, especially March, this is me. I don't know if others feel this way, but I think if you take from Kyrie trade on up, Jaden Hardy, I think that he probably makes a case for all second, all third in NBA rookie team. I think there's a real case to be made for that. Now, of course, we didn't see that through the totality of the season, but had we did, I think that he could have probably made a strong case for it. So I think, if he can find a role and one that benefits him well and benefits the team well, I think that's probably what I'm most looking forward to.
Yeah, I mean, his game reeks that of a true 3-level score, and we see plenty of those that come into the draft at this stage. But being able to harness the playmaking and ball handling aspects of that to be able to run an offense or be that secondary cog in terms of being a playmaker within the Mavericks offense, and riding the coattails, but also, providing that support when needed when he's playing with Kyrie and Luka is going to be, his drawing point in terms of if he's going to be, a guy that's seen as one of the best players off the bench next season potentially, or if he, is just going to elevate his standing in the rotation marginally for the Mavericks. But nonetheless, he's still young, plenty of time to grow. Definitely, like you alluded to, one of the fewer bright spots, I would say, throughout the season for the Mavericks, and really exciting young player. And that can't be said really throughout the Mavericks roster. So that's what I would have to say for that. Lastly, we have a couple questions to sort of knock off, a little more lighthearted, but still fairly provocative in nature in terms of, Jaden Hardy and his role on the Mavericks team. So first off, I wanted to provide one providing stat. I was going to do it this podcast. Jaren will be tasked with doing it in the next player profile. But the one surprising stat that I have for you guys today regarding Jaden Hardy. Now, take into account that not all of these are completely contextualized with, the sample size and everything right next to them. Some of them will be just vastly different than others, just kind of given the nature of the situation. But we just wanted to provide like one intriguing and provocative stat that could, we could really draw some attention to. And we tried to find it for at least each player, or that's our goal. We haven't done everybody yet, but we did Jaden Hardy, of course, for this podcast. And our one surprising stat for him throughout this season on assisted 3-point field goals. So meaning, it doesn't have to be catch and shoot. He could take a dribble or two, but just anyone where he has basically received a pass and he is shooting a three versus, obviously forging or creating a three for himself. He shot 82.5% on those throughout the season. Now, I don't know exactly what the sample size is, but he did take a lot of catch and shoot threes. That was an insane stat to me. I mean, that's really an unfathomable number for anybody, sample size aside, unless it's literally like 4 or 5 shots or something like that. Like, I was truly floored when I saw that. I know he's not getting the most minutes in the world, but I mean, we're at least talking like a decent sample size. Like, I'd have to imagine that that's got to be probably like half his threes, maybe, or more.
Probably half, and especially that later half of the season, I think that he took more catch and shoot, or at least assisted on threes, more than any shot in his arsenal.
Now, you may ask how, if he's shooting that good on assisted threes, how is he only shooting 40%? And I say only 40%, 40% is really good from three. He's conversely he shot 17.5% on unassisted threes. So there's definitely a stark difference there. But the catch and shoot numbers have me intrigued. And you see this guy warm up sometimes. If you've seen any of them, like the Mavericks sort of pregame videos, where they're shooting the balls off the racks, or just, from the assistant coaches, St. Jean spoon feeding him those passes. I mean, Jaden Hardy's a guy that's gone like, he'll just like continually hit them around the rack if you ever watch him pregame in those arenas. So, I mean, this is definitely a guy who's poised. And I mean, if he can reciprocate really any of that into his catch and shoot numbers, or if he can just even make that mildly sustainable, if we could just get 50% even on assisted 3-point field goal percentage next year, I mean, that would be insane itself, given the increased shot diet. So that's the one dig from the day. Other than that, we are going to be doing a sustainability rating for Jaden Hardy. This has kind of 3 factors that we have sort of taken into account here. And we're going to be doing this for every player as well. For the sustainability rating, it's not going to be only taking into account the players' like on-court sustainability in terms of, being, injured or not, and how many games they can play. It's also going to take into account their sustainability in terms of, being a Maverick in the future, along with, a variety of other factors. So basically any word, anything that you can kind of pencil into the category of sustainable, that kind of fits the mold of what we're looking for here. And it's going to be rated out of 10. And we're going to give a score to every player. And obviously the more sustainable players, obviously the better. And, this, we can factor it in with the player's desire to be here. There's a bunch of different angles you can kind of take to this. So Jaren, I'll give mine last. You go first. What's your sustainability rating for Jaden Hardy out of 10, and what's your reasoning?
So can we put a decimal in this?
Yes, you
Or
can put decimals.
okay, all right. Because I'm teeter-tottering around the 7 to 8 spot, so I'll sit with a 7.5. The reason why, I'm more on the positive side. Of course, we saw his level of production and his insane, March Madness of shooting, sort of prevail. I think that that's definitely really intriguing. He tailed off those last few games outside of the Chicago and outside of the Spurs game, but I think that it's really intriguing. Sort of the role that we predict him to have. I think that whatever stat or all the stats that we really saw this past season, I think that really benefits him and what role we think that he's going to have. That's why I sit, sort of in the higher spot. The reason why I'm kind of, not total 100% like the 8 or 9 spot is because I could definitely see him being included in a bigger package, maybe later down along the line, or just, maybe in the offseason, because as, Mr. Kidd denoted himself, there's going to be a lot of new faces here in Dallas, and I would not be surprised if given a big or at least a bigger name that he is included in one of those deals. And, an intriguing young piece. I wouldn't, depending on who the name is, of course, I wouldn't be totally opposed to putting him or packaging him in a deal, or at least making him a sweetener. So that's sort of why I'm sitting on that 7.5 spot. I think it's probably not too sweet, but it's sweet enough that you're like, okay, a 20-year-old guy going into his second year, you can see the upside there, but also at the same time, it's not totally rainbows and butterflies on the other side, because there is possibly a looming trade in which he could be included in.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think the Kyrie trade definitely sort of eliminates the need, as well as the potential top 10 pick that the Mavericks may accrue at the May 16th draft lottery that we'll be getting much more into in the coming weeks. That could obviously throw a potential Jaden Hardy spearheaded trade by the wayside a little bit in terms of the future. I don't know if, if we're looking way down the line, is Jaden Hardy sort of the predecessor to Kyrie? Is he going to end up taking his spot? I mean, that remains to be seen. There's a lot of different, just from a role perspective, one day, there's a lot that remains to be seen regarding this guy. And obviously, there's an argument to be made that his talent, production, and what his development may outmatch his role in the Mavericks rotation, just given that they have Luka and Kyrie at some point throughout the next couple of years. I don't know if that's going to happen next season, the season after that. So from that standpoint, I would definitely reciprocate with you on the sustainability aspect of, him just being on the team going forward. If the team does want to make a bigger trade. That being said, I do think that there is avenues, particularly since they're going to keep their pick, to be able to not include him in a trade and still, improve pretty marginally. So from that perspective, I don't think it's like just the only way to get better. But I do think that there's still that brisk possibility of him being in a trade. So I think I'd probably have to agree with you, anywhere really in that 7.5 to 8 range is probably where I would denote my ranking as far as Jaden Hardy's sustainability goes, because, I'm very optimistic about the on-court production. He hasn't shown anything as far as injuries are concerned that have me worried going forward. He's only 20 years old. So from that perspective, I feel very safe on my perspective. It's really just how sustainable is him being in Dallas long-term if the Mavericks are to improve the other areas of that roster. And I mean, I still think that they can do it. And, I wouldn't be as high and mighty on him as I am if I didn't think they could. But there are avenues to where he may not be here. But other than that, Jaren, do you have anything else to add in regards to Jaden Hardy? It's been a pretty fun podcast.
Yeah, so I mean, it actually has been a pretty fun podcast, I will not lie. I want to go over his the last full month of basketball in March. Just to cover this really quickly, he averaged 15.6 points, and this was all season high. 3 assists, 3 rebounds, only a turnover and a half, and 50% from the 3-point line and 45% from the field, and 23.5 minutes played. I think that's the top of the top basketball that we saw at Jaden Hardy in his rookie year. And I would be intrigued to see if, maybe he can continue it, because again, that's post Kyrie trade. Assuming we bring Kyrie back, how much can he benefit from Kyrie? We know he made those comments in the exit interviews that he was going to work with him over the offseason. So I'm intrigued to see what he learns or what he improves upon with that training with Kyrie in the offseason. So I think I'm really intrigued to see his offseason production. I think if there was an offseason god or most improved player of the offseason last year, it was probably Josh Green. And so I would not be surprised if, we have a watch list of guys, if Jaden Hardy, his name is probably included in those. So I'm intrigued to see what he can bring next year to the table.
No, 100%. Yeah, the mentorship with Kyrie is definitely going to be huge as far as his development goes if Kyrie stays on the team. Just out of curiosity, before we end the podcast, what were you said his assist numbers were like, I believe 3 in the month of March. What were they throughout the whole season? If you just don't mind listing out his counting stats for the whole year real quick.
Yeah, so for the whole year, he averaged 9 points per game, which I believe was like a 3-point production or a 3-point plus since the month of March. 1.4 assists, basically a 2 rebounds. Didn't really have any amazing defensive stats. Averaged a turnover a game, and then shot 47% from the field and 40% from the three throughout the regular season, and then 15 minutes a game. And again, you have to account for most of those sort of minutes, at least in the 3/4 of the season. He didn't really get to play a whole lot. So I think the minutes is a little skewed, but definitely in the minutes and roles in which he was given a production, or at least a plus role. We saw him really take advantage of that in most of the games that he was really, really a big part or an intricate part of the role, or I'm bluffing here. I'm bluffing here. Of the rotation. There we go. I don't know why it took me 45 minutes to come up with that. So
no, you're fine. It happens. But other than that, yeah, I think as far as his role is concerned, I know that a lot had been made by fans, just in regards to him, them pining for him to play more and things of that nature. I personally really didn't have too many issues with how they used him. I wanted him to be brought up to speed slow, and I didn't have the most high expectations. There's some gripes I have with Jason Kidd's rotation. Jaden Hardy wasn't really one of the biggest ones. I think towards the end of the season, I would definitely be a little bit more attuned to the sentiment that he should have played more. I do think that there were some times that they kind of gate kept his minutes a little bit and route to veterans. But when he was having some of those, sort of earlier season sort of rough bouts, and we see him hit a little bit of a rookie wall there, I wasn't like too really pissed off or anything in him not playing personally. But if that obviously continues ad nauseum next season, what we saw at the end of the year, just the inconsistency in terms of his role, that's going to be more cause for concern. But in a year that was basically lost, and we saw him play more down the stretch, I didn't really have too many personal gripes. But other than that, we will catch you guys in the next one. Thank you for listening to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. If you guys are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any other podcast platform, we are on almost all podcast platforms. You can find it in our link tree on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on any of those respective platforms that you're listening on, and give us a good review if you do feel so inclined. We really appreciate the feedback for those of you guys listening. Also, if you guys are listening on YouTube, or watching for that matter, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. We just hit 41 subscribers for Dirk.
Yes, sir, Dirk.
So make sure to comment down below, what was your favorite Dirk moment throughout his career to commemorate our insane milestone of 41 subscribers. Other than that, we will catch you guys in the next one. We will be doing our next player preview tomorrow. We are going to be knocking them out till we're all done with them every single day. Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is our one time that we're going to be besting Locked On as the most podcast out from the Mavericks perspective in a 9-day span, because they don't do weekends. Other than that, they probably have us beat most of the time. Barring that, we will catch you guys in the next one. Mainstream Mavs signing out.
Bye.